It's my pleasure and actually an honor to introduce Abby Wooldridge. Dr. Wooldridge is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the departments of Industrial and Enterprise Systems Engineering, Biomedical and Translational Sciences, Computer Science, Information Sciences, Kinesiology and Community Health, and at the Berkman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. She has a master's in Operations Research and Applied Statistics from the University of Louisville and a master's and PhD in Industrial Engineering. Dr. Wooldridge's research interests include, but are not limited to, patient safety, care transitions, team cognition, socio-technical systems, macroergonomics, which I don't even know what that is, but it sounds really cool, and human factors research. And I say all this partly to tout her many accomplishments, but also to point out that she has an incredibly multidisciplinary background. And I think that's one of the things that makes people interested in QE and successful in QE. And Abby has certainly been both of those things. On a more personal note, when Abby was at Wisconsin, I had the pleasure of being on her dissertation committee and also of having her in both my qualitative methods and in one of the first iterations of QE classes that I taught. So when you read the introduction to, or the dedication to QE and it's to the students over the years, Abby is definitely one of them. More important though, she is truly an all-around good egg and the kind of mentor that any student would be lucky to have. So I encourage you to reach out to her over the conference if you can or beyond. But for now, please join me in a virtual round of applause to welcome today's keynote speaker, Professor Abigail Wooldridge.
Thanks so much, David. I really appreciate that. Gosh, that means a lot to have a mentor say those things about you. So thank you very much. That's officially made the year and just barely into the second month. You've also covered some of the things that I was going to cover, which might make this a little bit easier. So today I'm going to be talking to you about quantitative ethnography in a little bit different context, specifically in my area, human factors and ergonomics, and how QE is helping me to not only solve the research problems that I want to solve, but also really advance the theory and science of my discipline. There we go. So as David said, I might be a little bit different than a lot of the folks here because I don't study learning or education. I did end up in some ed psych classes during my PhD, but I'm an engineer through and through. I think about solving problems for people. I did do my undergraduate work and my first master's at the University of Louisville, which is very much focused on producing really excellent industrial engineers that can go and be practicing engineers. I was really interested in quantitative modeling there, but in healthcare settings. And while I was thinking about healthcare, I got interested in this field called human factors and ergonomics. So when I was at University of Wisconsin, even though I was still in the IE department, I was thinking a lot about people and how people fit in systems. And you're actually going to hear quite a bit about that today. Since my time at Wisconsin, I have been at the University of Illinois. And just some important things for you to maybe know about me as I'm talking. I'm a pragmatic scholar, meaning the most philosophical thinking I do about research is usually with people on this call. I tend to want to solve the problem that I'm interested in solving. And to do that, I'm going to use whatever method will solve the problem the most effectively and in the best way possible. In other words, I'm a mixed methods researcher. And I do work in the field. All of my work involves me going and talking to people or interacting with them in some way. Could be just observing, could be administering surveys, or my personal favorite, conducting interviews while I watch them work or after I watch them work. So when I was invited to give this talk today, I was a little bit befuddled for a moment about, but why me? What am I gonna talk about? So then I started thinking about it and I realized quantitative ethnography has had this really kind of profound impact in how I conduct my work and how I think about science. And I think it could possibly do the same for you all. and anybody that we interact with as we're trying to grow this community. So as David said, while I was at UW, I ended up in his qualitative methods class as part of my minor in field methods research, mixed field methods research. And then I took the QE, I think it wasn't your first time, I think you had offered it before, a QE class. And that got me really thinking about how I can use these methods in my dissertation, which focused on understanding how to design work systems for teams in care transitions, where I used both ENA and the ROAR tool. Now you're going to see this again. So this is just my first preface. When you hear me say I'm designing work systems, that means I'm thinking about how to design things that humans use to accomplish a goal. Doesn't have to be paid work, could be something as simple as exercising. My work has continued. I'm still thinking about designing work systems and processes to support teams, usually in healthcare. And now I'm getting to finally experiment with encoder as well. So I'm excited to grow my QE portfolio, so to speak. I've broken one of my cardinal rules, which means I started talking to you without telling what we were going to talk about today. So here it is now. I just introduced myself, and I titled my talk intentionally to emphasize that I'm talking about QE in a different setting than learning sciences, but we're going to bookend it with where QEers are doing work now and where our community could go in the future. And human factors is kind of the case study, so to speak. So first, where are quantitative ethnographers now? I'm going to be the first to say this was very much a quick and dirty scoping review. I actually just saw this morning a paper that came out with this conference that I think probably did this a little bit better than I did, from Gould and colleagues, scoping review. But I went on Google Scholar and just did a real quick search for quantitative ethnography, in quotes, could be anywhere in the citation, removed the duplicates, and also made sure everything was in English so I could read it. And we ended up with about 368 results. And you can see we are having like this really nice exponential growth here in the last couple of years. Did a little bit of snooping around. I think David's career grant that really started off some of this ENA methods is right about here. So you can see some pretty good steady growth. And then in the last couple of years, just we're shooting off the chart, which is super. Then I took those results and I just wanted to see where are people doing this kind of work? Because I think that could tell us a lot about where we are now. One rater, so yes, I know this is not the most rigorous. If I was going to publish this, I'd definitely suggest doing it with 2, but I just grouped them in sciences or domains that made sense. So for example, if the title had something like student, teacher in it, or it was in a learning analytics or learning sciences type journal, it went in the learning science category, which incidentally is the biggest and perhaps unsurprisingly given where QE originated. But you can see there's all of these other fields that are slowly starting to pick up, whether it's social sciences, really focused on strong, rigorous research methods, child development, healthcare, or others. So kind of the point I'm trying to convince you of today is that quantitative ethnography can and should go beyond the learning sciences. I think QE has really important contributions to make in other disciplines. And I'm going to use human factors as an example to try and convince you of that today. And then we'll spend the last few minutes of this talk kind of thinking about where do we go from here? What's next? And I will be the first to tell you, I don't have all the answers for that, but I have ideas. So like I said, I'm focusing on human factors as the case study. I did make that intentionally broad since I talk about teams and designing organizations too. I can't see everyone's video. So have other people heard of human factors? Maybe know what it is? I know some of you have heard me say the word a little bit. So if you haven't, I'm going to put on my teacher hat. I just got off my intro to human factors class for the day. So ergonomics or human factors, depending on what country you're from, is really the science that thinks a lot about how humans work and how humans work in systems. So we understand how humans interact with each other interact with technology, interact with the physical environment, and then think about how we can optimize those interactions so that the humans are happier, are safer, and also do their work better so we get better output. So like I said, we think about a lot of different things. It could be physical environment, it could be pieces of technology or tools, or even how we design organizations. In case that's a little bit too abstract for you, we're going to do a really quick interactive example to just give you an idea about what a human factors perspective can bring to designing a piece of technology or a tool for people to use. Okay, so this is participatory. I hope you've had your coffee for the day. If you've ever seen a lab result, maybe had your own blood drawn or that of a family member or even a pet, you might have seen something like this before. So the idea is they draw blood or another fluid from your body, they analyze it, they usually calculate some quantitative value and then decide whether or not your value from your sample is in a normal range, right? So what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you an example of a lab result. And then as quickly and accurately as you can, you're going to figure out how many of those results are normal or not. Normally, I would say close your eyes or put your head down when you're done, but we're on Zoom, so I have to adapt a little bit. So just drop in chat the number you think are not normal. It's timed. You have a high workload today. We're going to look at lots of these lab results. So you're trying to go as quick as you can. After 30 seconds, this is going to go away. Okay? Okay. Here we go. Drop in chat how many you think are not normal as fast as you can. Okay. All right, so I see mostly ones, a few zeros, and maybe a few twos coming through. All right, so that was kind of stressful, huh? Especially with the rush. We're gonna do it again. And it's still timed, so you're still trying to go really fast. So give this one a try. How many are outside of the normal range? Yep. Yep. Super. So you've all responded a lot faster. In fact, before the timer's even gone out, when the time before, people were still typing in as we go. So what was the difference here? The first example was actually a little bit cognitively complex. If you were trying to do this for your job, you have to look at this display, find the lab result, then go over and figure out which reference range matches that result, make the comparison assessment say in range or out of range. And basically every step in that process was an opportunity for error, right? The other one is actually the exact same results, just with this new display added. So you just have to scan and see, is the dark bar outside of the little thin bars that indicate normal or not? So the display kind of did the comparison for you, and all you have to do is perceive it. This has been shown to have an impact on quality of care because you make more accurate decisions, and it also lets people work a little bit faster and reduces their mental workload, which has long-term implications for stress and burnout. So this is an example of what human factors can be used to do in designing technology to support work. Just a question, did anybody notice what the patient was? It's a doggy. I'm a dog person. And this example came from Sue Bosley, a pharmacist, so thanks to her. So anyway, that's an example of what human factors can do. Now we do that in usually 3 different domains that we talk about. We might do that sort of thing in a physical setting where maybe we redesign a desk chair or the lighting in an environment so that the human can interact better with the environment to do their work better. We might design things that change or improve how people perceive information, process information, and then respond. That's the cognitive box up or bubble up at the top. Or we might start thinking how humans and technology interact and human-computer interaction, or even how humans interact with other humans, or how humans interact with autonomous agents and teaming. And then finally, how we put all that together to design a socio-technical system. That's where I tend to fall. The fancy word in the US for this is macroergonomics. So now you know macroergonomics is designing socio-technical systems and organizations to support teamwork or support humans. But I do a little bit in teamwork too. So as a macroergonomist, this is one of the models that underpins my research. I say that we can describe any goal-directed activity, something you're doing with a purpose, whether it's to make yourself lunch or a job you have to do to get paid. You're going to do that by completing a task, using tools and technology in some environmental setting, whether it's physical or kind of regulatory bodies that influence your work, and an organizational context that includes things like culture, policies, procedures, schedules, etc. All of those work system elements, what we call them, interact to dictate how your process of accomplishing that goal unfolds. And ultimately that process results in outcomes like whether or not you accomplish your goal and whether or not you are healthy and safe after you've tried to accomplish your goal. In a healthcare setting, we call that the SEEPS model. We actually call it that outside of healthcare. But in healthcare, we're usually talking about things like patient outcomes, quality of care, patient safety, as well as employee and organizational outcomes like efficiency and costs, as well as whether employees are having a high turnover and stress rate. So this model is what I was socialized with really early in my PhD work. And I started seeing the entire world this way as an interaction of those work system elements that dictates how processes unfold. And then I showed up in David's class and he started showing these network models. And all I could see was every work system element is a node and there are lines connecting them, just like you see in ENA. So that's where quantitative ethnography really clicked for me, and I got really excited about being able to examine those relationships. So now I'm going to show you an example of me using ENA to examine those relationships and talk a little bit more about why that's such an important thing for human factors. To do that, I'm going to tell you about a study I've been working on, or a series of studies I've been working on since my dissertation that focuses on care transitions. If you've not heard the term care transitions, you might have heard transitions of care, handoffs, or handovers, but these are all things where the information about a patient's care, as well as authority and responsibility for a patient's care, are transferred from a clinician or group of clinicians to another, or a care team to another care team. These are really, really critical to ensure patient safety. There's a lot of opportunities for miscommunication, information to be lost, mistakes to be made, and they can and do result in lots of patient harms up to and including deaths, as well as costs to the healthcare industry. I've got to be a human factors person, say, but they can also be really good. You can identify errors at the same time. It can be opportunities for resilience. But at the end of the day, Siri's talking to me, sorry. At the end of the day, you have people working together to accomplish this goal of transitioning the care of a patient. My example comes specifically from transitions that happen between hospital units. So we're actually going to be talking about the transition of a patient who's had surgery from the operating room to an intensive care unit. So the data that I'm about to show you comes actually, some of it comes from my dissertation data from UW, where I was comparing the perspective and experience of clinicians who participate in a team handoff, where surgeons and anesthesiologists and nurses from the operating room talk to the physicians and nurses and technicians from the ICU together, or when the conversations are not connected and occur a little bit haphazardly, where the surgeon might talk to a physician and the anesthesiologist might also talk to the physician and maybe the nurse might not get to talk to the anesthesiologist at all. So we call that a separate handoff. Now, to accomplish this work, we did interviews with all of those clinical roles, asking them questions about how the care transition unfolded, organized around that model that I showed you that had all those connections, as well as asking them examples of care transitions that went well and went poorly and why they went well and poorly. Then first we cleaned the transcripts, de-identified them, and segmented the data into groups of text or turns of talk that were meaningful and related. And we did inductive thematic analysis, so more of a grounded approach that then we went back and compared to the literature before finally starting to quantify those themes, first by counting and then by exploring relationships. Without going into the human factors side of the results very much, I just want to give you an example of some of the things that we were looking for. So in that interview process, clinicians told us about 3 really important cognitive activities that happen between clinicians. So they exchange information, that's the middle box that we're starting with. They exchange information between each other. They synthesize information and assess what it means, and then they make decisions about patient care. And all of those processes were influenced by all of the work system elements, as we would expect with that model. So for example, they talked about how in a team handoff, you might have very diverse backgrounds of participants who have different perspectives and motivation to participate. Whereas if you do it separately, you have less diverse backgrounds and the people who you're talking to probably really want to be there. There are some themes that came out from the data that were indicative of relationships between work system elements or interactions, like whether or not the organization has designed its staffing model so that the same person who performed the surgery, the surgeon, is also the attending physician in the ICU. Or if there are even enough people to facilitate a real pause for this conversation. So that's one example. You can see we have themes under all of the other work system elements: task, tools and technologies, physical environments, organizations. And the way those work system elements interact to allow those communication processes to occur then impacts the outcomes of that care transition, whether or not information was clear, sufficient, and accurate, whether it was efficient, so on. By the way, those results were presented at the last ICQE up in Madison. So the next step, I'm an engineer. I told you I'm an engineer. Just to do some counts to see what's the most common. Well, okay, information exchange seems to be mentioned the most often. That makes sense. The definition of a care transition is the exchange of information, authority, and responsibility for patient care. We can see that all the work system elements are involved and outcomes are talked about a lot, but this isn't super helpful if you're trying to figure out, well, is a team handoff better than a separate handoff or not? Or what makes a team handoff better than doing it separately? Started looking at, ooh, can you all hear me now? I see thumbs up, so I'm going to assume we're good. So I started looking to understand what's good about a team handoff and what's bad. So just sheer categorization, doing it together as a team improves understanding because people all hear the same thing. And it's more effective and efficient because you get to do it all at once rather than multiple conversations spread out over time. But it's a large group of people and it creates delays. We can do the same thing for doing it separately, but what ends up happening here is those opinions indicate relationships between the work system elements, whether doing it together, the team handoff, creates this larger group of people who have to interact that results in distractions because all of those people are talking together. And that's what we really wanted to get by looking at the impact of the team handoff to understand those relationships. So that's when I started really thinking about using QE. This is an example of one line out of an interview where an anesthesia resident is talking about a team handoff, and they're saying, well, if we're doing a team handoff and we're in a physical environment where the lines on the monitors are tangled, the patient's coughing, and we're looking for pieces of equipment that we cannot find, we might actually end up having to tell people information multiple times, which decreases our efficiency because they're distracted and not able to engage. So this kind of story is showing a relationship between the two work system elements, person and physical environment, that impacts the process and the outcome. And this sort of relationship is really important to understand, because if you look at the science of human factors and macroergonomics, we talk a lot about how those systems interact. We'll say things like, you cannot change one element because it impacts all of the others. Say that a lot when we're talking about putting in a new technology. But the problem is we don't really get a lot deeper than that in our science. We provide a few anecdotal evidence, put in a nice quote with a little figure like what I just showed you, and say these relationships are important and we need to consider them, but we don't go much deeper than that. So that leads to a gap in our theory. How do work system elements actually interact? How do we know if interactions are good and bad? And then it also means that I don't really know how to solve the problem of care transitions without understanding those relationships. So it's two problems, or two sides of the same problem, very practical, and then also advancing my science and theory. So going back to that first thing I thought when I saw the very first network ENA graph, I thought, oh my goodness, ENA can actually be a way for us to model and quantify these relationships. So that's some of the work that I've been doing in my lab recently. So this is an example of taking data from those interviews where individual participants either said something explicitly very good, like I like team handoffs because, or explicitly said something very negative about the different handoff organizations, and then comparing them. One thing that I also think has changed my perspective from the ethnography part of QE is being really conscious of understanding how the experience of different types of participants can influence the data. So here, we're not just looking at relationships between good things about team handoffs and bad things about team handoffs relative to good things about doing individual handoffs versus bad things about that. We're also looking at the difference in experience from physicians, who typically have more power and authority in the healthcare setting, versus nurses, who typically do not. So one of my students presented this work at HFES last year, which is the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society's annual meeting. And we were making the point that physicians and nurses actually are making different connections between different work system elements. So for physicians, when they're talking about good things in team handoffs, they're talking a lot about how the aspects of the person, like having everyone there, help the handoff run very efficiently. Whereas nurses are saying things more along the lines of having everyone there lets me do my job because I get to hear from a physician as well as my counterpart nurse in the other unit. And then of course, ENA lets us do some interesting comparisons statistically. So not only can we say these edges are heavier because they're darker and thicker, we can also compare them. And these were not statistically significantly different. Now, the ethnography part of this, from my perspective, is physicians thought there were bad things about team handoffs because they thought it was a strain on them to repeat information multiple times and perhaps have to answer too many questions. Whereas the nurses, again, keeping in mind the ones that usually have a little bit less power in healthcare, to say, no, stop, I need you to give me this information, they had nothing bad to say about team handoffs. In fact, they liked it because they got all the information they need, as we saw in the previous diagram. We did the same thing for the groups who experienced the individual handoffs that were done separately. So again, physicians liked the individual handoffs because they thought they were more efficient. We have fewer people, so you see that little connection from person to task to organization. But again, nurses have nothing good to say here. They don't get the information they need. And then with the negative opinions of handoffs, physicians are again talking about not having people at the handoff doing it together leads to disruption and confusion, whereas the nurse is saying, well, it's actually more related to task. By not having all the people, I can't do my work. It's not just about the disruption and the handoff. This difference, by the way, was statistically significantly different. So what we're doing going forward, now we're starting to get ENA models of how work system elements interact to make processes go well and not well, is we're actually exploring that across other healthcare processes. And we're looking to see what we can do with that. So of course, we have the more typical example of saying, well, we understand in this specific context that having this type of technology available to these people lets us get better outcomes. But by doing it across multiple healthcare processes in various settings, we'll eventually start to make real strides in understanding how work system elements truly interact and can influence processes and outcomes in healthcare, as well as how teams work in my specific research interests. So this is pretty cool. And actually, I'll be presenting some of that work, and I think maybe one of the first exposures to the international ergonomics community to quantitative ethnography later this year. So I'm really excited about that. So what I was trying to do, and I'm hoping you agree with me, I have a feeling you might be a little bit biased to agree with me, that QE presents a lot of advantages, and we should be trying to grow and spread and share QE across many disciplines, not just staying where we are today. So going back to our graph, that quick and dirty literature search, more than half of the papers were from learning sciences. And I think we're growing. I think we'll continue to grow. And as we think about where QE could go next, I want you to encourage to think about if there's a natural fit with your current work that you're not using quantitative ethnography techniques in, or collaborators that you're working with but not using QE with. How can you integrate QE methods, but also the philosophy that underpins the work this group does? That light bulb moment for me of I need to consider the background and profession of the healthcare professional, not just that they're a clinician or not a clinician. I'd also encourage you to think about new domains or new research partners. I'll give you one example. When I was doing this literature review, I saw a lot of people designing technology for students to use. And I was thinking, oh, well, that's kind of cool. I bet there's human factors considerations there. I wonder if we could partner. So I'd really encourage you to think that way too. And then also, of course, the question always comes back for me when I think about growing a community, is how are we actually going to do it? How are you going to educate these new disciplines about QE and the philosophy and the methods that we use? And how are we going to actually get there and do the outreach? So I don't have all the answers, but I do have a few suggestions. One of the things that I love about this conference is if you look at the schedule, it's not all folks from learning sciences. You have people who are talking about teams and organizations, and I'd really encourage you to seek out those talks that are outside your research area or the domain that you normally work in. And while you're there, think about how QE fits with it and what QE means to you. It took me a while to be able to think about QE in a philosophical way. So maybe there's something that you're not thinking about too that you could push yourself on. And then while you're here, try and form partnerships. I'll go ahead and say it again. If you design tech for education, especially teams, and you want a human factors perspective, I'd love to chat with you. And then I think the next step for us as a community, and I rather suspect that the ISQE group and advisory board is already thinking about this, and I see in the chat someone is thinking about QE and nursing ed. Think about how we can spread the word and convince other people to drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and help each other while we do that. So like I said, I don't have all the answers for how to do these things, but I really hope that I have presented a somewhat convincing argument that QE can help solve the individual research challenge that you might be facing, but also advance your home science if QE is not it. And I really think we can have a huge impact. So that's the end of my talk. I'm really hoping to have a nice discussion about where we go from here.
That's great, Evie. Thanks so much. Thanks for switching us back to the gallery view so we can see each other. So yeah, I definitely would. I'm curious about questions that that people have, having heard your talk. I confess, you didn't really need to work very hard to convince me that QE should spread, but I'm, as you say, biased. But given that I'm moderating the session, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking you a few things that came to my mind as you were talking, and hopefully that will also spur some other questions from other folks. So you mentioned giving the the first talk at a Human Factors Society using QE, and the first talk at an international society using QE, International Human Factors. I'm wondering, like, can you talk a little bit about how uptake has looked in the fields that you move in, whether it's happening at all? And also, as somebody who was a graduate student and is now still an assistant professor, like, what are some of the challenges or barriers that you're facing just in terms of your own career trajectory? Because I think a lot of people are thinking about those same issues.
Yeah, that's a really big question. So I'm going to try and break it down, and I'm going to count on you to say, no, you didn't answer this part when I'm done.
Okay.
So the uptake part is something that I've actually really enjoyed, and I think has been in some ways a little bit easier for me because I'm an engineer. So I'm an engineer, always been in an industrial engineering department. And engineers really like quantitative models. I mean, most of us are pretty biased. Quantitative is better. And I consider myself, if I have to choose a camp, I'm not allowed to say mixed methods researcher. I put myself in the qualitative bucket, which means I'm not normal at all. So being able to have quantitative ethnography tools like ENA to be able to quantify the qualitative work that I'm doing has actually been really a huge part in my work kind of being taken up and in some ways recognized as legitimate by some of my colleagues. I'm in a very quantitative heavy department now, and I'm the only human factors person there. So being able to show some chops with network analysis is a huge asset to me. But it also means that when I talk to other human factors engineers who may not be as qualitatively inclined as I am, they really like it. And then of course, all my qualitative friends get really excited about, now we can actually do something to compare rather than frequency counts or have a logistic regression equation that then we have to try and interpret. The networks are super easy to visualize once you understand how they work. So they're really, really effective in journal articles and at conferences. Now, the one downside I will say is you have to be able to go into the nitty-gritty in the mathematics to present. A lot of times when I was first starting to show this at human factors, in human factors groups and at human factors conferences, and nobody had seen it, they would say, but how are the networks constructed? So you have to be able to go pretty heavy into the math if you need to. And it helps a lot if you can find a analogous method to explain it. So around the time that I was trying to present this for the first time, I was taking a course that did some PCA, principal components analysis, and some clustering analysis. And the math had a lot of overlap from my perspective. So I use that as an analogy for my colleagues who maybe have done more survey analysis, but haven't applied that type of approach to qualitative data. And it's like a light bulb click. So it's a combination of knowing your audience and what you're going to need, but also having kind of the technical depth to back it up rather than just say, ooh, this is a pretty picture and this is what the pretty picture means.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. I mean, but so you're saying you haven't actually had much pushback. People aren't saying that you shouldn't use it or that it's somehow problematic, but partly that's because you're in a field that's quantitative heavy. Is that the sort of idea?
I think it's the answer of I've not had any pushback at all is very appropriate. But it's for two different reasons. So in the human factor space, we're more used to doing qualitative or mixed methods or ethnographic type work because part of designing systems for people is first understanding how people act in the existing system. So we have that background. Anyway. Yeah, it helps a lot. So we're really just excited to have a new tool to play with. And in the engineering side, it brings a legitimacy to the qualitative work that wouldn't be there otherwise.
I see. Great. So you talked a little bit in your part of your plea was for what we as individuals can do to help the spread, which I appreciated. I never loved the Kool-Aid metaphor, since those of you who actually know where it comes from,
I know
it's kind of it's all problematic. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, not about what we as individuals can do, but there's a new society, there are these conferences. I'm wondering if there's something that kind of collectively we can do rather than just through individual actions that would either help the spread of, help the spread of QE, or help individuals who are interested kind of come up to speed. Does that make sense as a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really funny you asked that because I was kind of keeping an eye on the Slack channel yesterday, and I think you, Andrew, brought up the special interest group in healthcare, and then you were kind of pushing around on process. How are these formed? How do we know these exist? I think that would actually be a really nice way to organize ourselves in some regards. If you look at some of those domains that I pulled out, there is healthcare on there. There's enough of us writing about quantitative ethnography and healthcare that it came up. So I think from a structural perspective or an organizational perspective, the society could certainly play a role in making that happen. I can speak a little bit from my experience in human factors. We are our own science, but to do our science, we require a domain to work in. So we end up doing a lot of outreach ourselves. Like I'm involved in reaching out to the healthcare community. So we think some about, well, maybe we need to form white papers or committees to write white papers about how human factors applies to healthcare or to military operations or to aviation or to fill in the blank. Maybe it's a similar idea that those folks who are involved in those special interest groups could do that and then actually go and publish that in those journals or go to those conferences and start giving talks and doing workshops. And then I think actually the society is already doing a pretty nice job with getting folks the tools, like with the COVID data challenge and pairing up with mentors and having a really nice webinar session. I'm not sure I have any really innovative ideas there, but I think it's keep doing the great stuff that's already happening.
Okay, so I have one more process question. You moved to a new place and had to set up a lab and start working with students. I don't even know whether you're teaching a course on QE, but like, how do you come to a new place and set up that machinery? I know Goal has had to do the same thing. Zach
Yeah.
Swicky is about to do that. There are many other people, or not many, but there are other people. Like, what words of wisdom do you have for somebody who's trying to kind of, I don't want to, I'm not going to use a metaphor, to do that, right?
Yeah. I think it depends some on where you're going. So my experience coming into a department, completely adding a subdiscipline of that department is quite a bit different than what it might have looked like if I went somewhere with established human factors group. So the biggest thing for me has been finding students in the department who are interested in doing qualitative work. And what ended up happening is it took me a little bit to recruit my first PhD student. And I think the best advice I could have there for brand new folks building their first lab is, if you're in a tenure track position, yeah, you need to get a student pretty quickly, especially if your department has expectations about you having graduated someone before tenure, but you don't want to make a choice that makes your life harder. So it's okay to take a year to find a student who's actually going to do it, rather than finding a square peg to fit in a round hole. And then the other thing is finding your people. So one of the things that you might have noticed, I know you noticed, David, because you had to say it all, is I have lots of courtesy appointments in other departments. And that's because those other departments are where I have my peers that I can go talk about and refine some of my more qualitative research methodologies. So you got to find your community. And in some cases, you have to build it by recruiting the special students that you need.
Great, that's super. So I see we have a couple of questions in the chat here. I always have lots more to ask, but I want to hear what some other people get in. It looks like Cinnamon has a question, and then Andrew has his hand up. So why don't we start with Cinnamon, and then we can go to Andrew and go from there.
Yeah, so Cinnamon's asking how many involve their participants in the review, analysis, and dissemination of your QE data in order to validate some of the results, spread the QE word within stakeholder worlds in the field, and determine next steps for research. So first, I'm not going to make a statement about everybody. I think that could be an interesting thing to explore, but I will say one of the things I look at in saying, you know, I fall in the qualitative camp, is how to do rigorous qualitative research. And if you're in the healthcare space, there's this really nice paper. It's written by DeVers from 1999, and it takes kind of the typical empirical models of rigor for quantitative work, and then offers parallel or analogous criteria for rigorous qualitative research, and outlines some strategies to support each of those criteria. And one of the strategies that is important across multiple criteria is subject matter checking, or member checking. So you take your results back to your participants and ask them what they think, and did you interpret the data right? And this is also something that I'm pretty sure David taught us in that first qualitative methods class. So I'd imagine that most of us are doing this just as part of making sure the ethnographic part of our work is rigorous. So I would suspect quite a bit to validate the results. The stakeholder part is interesting, because if I'm doing research with academic clinicians, they get really excited about QE too. They like the network analysis, and they start thinking about how they could use it in their work. But when I'm working with, I'm working on a project with folks who are experiencing food insecurity, the people who aren't academics don't seem to care much about the research methods. It's more the output, and did you capture their meaning, the EMIC meaning versus the EDIC meaning. So I think it depends on who your stakeholders are and who your participants are, about if they're really going to get interested and excited about quantitative ethnography, whether it has more implications for other academics and scientists.
Cinnamon, you You had put your question in chat. I just want to make sure I give you a moment if you want to say anything more to in response, or make sure that we understood your question correctly. And it didn't mean to just have you be text and then disappear necessarily.
No, not at all. I have chainsaws going on here, so I have to keep on shutting off my volume and sometimes my video because of what's going on in the house. No, that captures a lot of it. I just think a lot of the people that we're studying and involving in our research, whether especially in healthcare and in business and in education, those are also future researchers in several cases. And so how do we get them to be able to look at the quantitative ethnography data and see how it is representative of something that they're actually going through, something they might have to implement, and how that might be beneficial for their own future research?
Yeah, you're raising the point that the diagrams are meant to be consumed by researchers, and that doesn't always translate so well. I mean, so for example, you don't member check by showing somebody the betas in a regression and saying, did I get the betas right? There's some different way of communicating. So Andrew, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. This was a really great talk. I'm really always excited to see where your research is going. And my question is actually, you know, as you pointed out, right, you're always in the field and you're working with practitioners when you're doing your work. And so building a little bit off the previous question, I'm actually curious what your experience has been in getting practitioners to, you know, whether it's change their behaviors or design new systems, that kind of thing, based on the kind of QE findings that you found. Because I think in addition to the issue that David was just touching on and Cinnamon before about communicating the results themselves to stakeholders, there's also a question of just, here's what we've found, you know, sort of regardless of how we found it, you know, we figured out a better way to do something, or we've identified a particular class of problem that needs more. And I'm curious, you know, sort of how you approach the transition from the kind of research finding to the kind of practice recommendations, or the, you know, or the, you know, like actually changing the systems that you're doing research on, which I think is, you know, I think a lot of us work in spaces where that's an end goal, but it's one that, you know, sometimes seems like it's constantly sort of one step away.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question for a number of reasons. And the easy answer is to say, well, I have collaborators who are focused on kind of implementation and implementation science, and they get involved at that point, which is true. I mean, Edmund Ramley is in the Department of Family Medicine, I think, at UW, and he does a lot of implementation work to understand how to implement it. But Edmund has a really similar background that I have. And the one thing that you didn't see in that little narrow focus that I presented today is that we understand what's happening in the perspective of the workers, and we try to describe the current work system, and then we figure out how to improve it. But it's not a one-way kind of prescriptive approach. In fact, there's another buzzword is called participatory ergonomics, which means that we involve the workers, the people I'm doing research on, in the actual project and the design team. So when I'm designing a new piece of technology or a new way of organizing a process, which I actually prefer to new technology, is it's not just me and, you know, the research team saying, okay, we got this data from you, and it indicates that your problem is that your physical environment is too loud and there's not enough people present to exchange information. So now you're going to be together. Instead, we would actually have a participatory design process where we brought together representatives from those stakeholders, probably not ever all of the stakeholders, because that gets really big, but some representatives, some physicians, some nurses from both hospital units, for example, and then said, okay, based on the analysis we've done so far, this is what your current process looks like. These are what you and your colleagues told us doesn't work. And here are some suggestions we have based on our science. And we might even go into a little bit of an education session with them about this is how technology impacts how people work. And then we collaboratively design them together. So it really ends up being a participatory kind of co-designed, co-constructed process, which then helps with the actual implementation part. Because now those stakeholders who have been on the design team are invested in it, right? They believe in it, they think it's good. So then when we go to evaluate it, they start getting their colleagues involved. And then when we've done some initial evaluation, some piloting, some refining the process, because it's never right the first time, and we start to actually pilot it for real and implement it for real, there's already buy-in. It's not consultant types or scientist types coming in and saying, and now you shall do. They've helped construct it. So I think that really plays an important role. And that's true across contexts, I guess. I work a lot with professional healthcare, like healthcare professionals, people who actually get paid to do it. But some of my colleagues work with informal caregivers who aren't paid, and they do the same thing, but they get even more involved in defining the problem. So you don't just have some engineer shooting around in the dark saying, oh, you need a new piece of technology to keep track of your meds, when it turns out maybe that specific population really just wants a notebook with a cue card to remember to ask their clinicians certain questions.
Thanks. Andrew, anything you want to follow up on that, or should we move on?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Abby.
So I see, so first of all, I invite people to just put their hands up. I always find it's easier to ask questions by just asking them than putting them in the text. Mark has a question in the text, and I'm going to throw it to him to ask his question in one sec. But I just want to clarify something that it looks like is in Mark's question. When you were doing the interviews from the data that you were showing us, were those one-on-one interviews, or are you actually interviewing the whole care team?
Yeah. So that's a good question. In this particular data set, they were one-on-one interviews for actually one of the reasons that Mark brings out. Healthcare does have a hierarchy type of issue. People who are at the top of the hierarchy, the senior or attending physicians, usually don't get contradicted. Someone who's lower in the hierarchy might have a problem saying, no, that's not right, or I don't agree. So in this case, they were completely separated. I have done group interviews in other studies, but I still do tend to break them up by profession unless there's a specific reason to have them together, like those design teams I was talking about to Andrew. And then in those design teams, it really falls on me and my team as kind of the facilitators to make sure that doesn't happen. So we always have, ground rules, and we talk about them regularly. And if I or we hear that someone's not offering suggestions, they're just looking there and they look uncomfortable, then we might ask, hey, it seems like you might have something to say. Would you be willing to say it? And it really becomes more of a facilitator role rather than just a researcher role.
I see. All right, so Mark, let me throw the floor to you. I just wanted to make sure I understood the situation when you were asking your question.
I have to apologize because I was late for your presentation, so you might have said some things which I've asked about here. But I'm particularly interested in this because I've done some work in this area. I think I can just give an idea of what happens in the UK. And this stuff comes to the fore when people die or they get seriously injured through a medical accident or an incident. And what happens is, first of all, that has to be reported. And obviously, if it's a serious incident, things are reported. Even if it's a minor incident, something should be reported, but that doesn't always happen. Now, it's very interesting as to why that doesn't always happen, because there's all sorts of, there's meant to be a no blame culture, but sometimes it doesn't work. When something serious does happen, there has to be a committee which investigates the incident, writes a report, makes recommendations to stop the thing happening again. And to be honest, if you talk to people who work in this area, they'll tell you it doesn't work. They write their report, they do the investigation, they write their report, they make the recommendations are implemented, and then the same thing happens again a year down the line. So, I mean, there are some really important questions here, but so much seems to be buried in very deep things within human beings, within the human work context. And I think there is obviously some very interesting areas for exposing some of the dynamics and some of the communicative dynamics in these incidents. And of course, the problem is that most of the time we only know after the event. So you're only capturing what happened post hoc, really. But what do you feel? I mean, this is a huge industry. There's a huge amount of money invested in trying to improve patient safety, trying to improve healthcare. What do you see as the potential for these techniques that you're showing for actually really doing something that works?
Well, you're asking some really big questions, and I agree. The current healthcare system doesn't work, and there are challenges. I'm thinking particularly of a paper that I am a co-author on that outlined opportunities for human factors and systems engineering to improve healthcare. And we focused on a few different discipline or domains or potential problem types in healthcare, and then kind of set an agenda and made some calls for how we could make this happen. So I think really generally, I could probably spend hours talking about this, and I'm looking at the clock trying to figure out how much time I can spend here. So the one thing I will say is I do think human factors has a lot of tools, what I've shown you today, but also a lot beyond there that we can contribute. There are really useful ways of capturing complexity and investigating accidents and errors, and then going forward and thinking about doing risk analysis proactively. And we can use some of these techniques to frame those discussions. So that work system model I showed, I think, is a nice way to systematically capture all of the elements of the system that could influence work. It does require a little bit of education, and I think would be a really good opportunity to build a participatory ergonomics program in hospitals. That's been implemented in other domains, but not quite as much healthcare. There are other tools too, though, so I can't speak broadly because there's not enough time, but I would say generally, I think quantitative ethnography provides us a strong background in being able to use kind of more traditional ethnographic tools that maybe not all healthcare professionals or clinical researchers or even human factors researchers are exposed to, about going and understanding the work environment, whether or not an accident has happened. And then I think QE can play a role in modeling complexity by showing how those work system elements interact, which then can lead us to perhaps proactively be able to identify issues before they occur. The one thing that I've been focusing on is one system, but what happens at broader system interfaces, not just from one hospital unit to another hospital unit, but from hospital discharge to home. I think those interfaces are going to be a little bit more complex and a little bit trickier. I'd also just like to suggest, if you are interested in the topic and you want to read more, definitely look for that 2018 Health Affairs paper I'm an author on. But in the UK specifically, Patrick Watterson is a researcher at Loughborough who does a lot of really, really excellent work with human factors to improve patient safety, as well as in other safety critical domains. So you could definitely learn a lot from him. That's my 3-minute summary of there's so much to say here. I can't say anything at all.
That's a great summary. Even I understood it. So it looks like Hendrik has his hand up. I'm assuming that it's Hendrik. Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure which Hendrik it was, but now I see it's the Hendrik I thought it was. Hi, Hendrik.
Hey, David. Hey, congratulations. Fantastic conference. Great to see. And I also did some work on patient safety, surely without ENA at that time. And it's tough. People get harmed and it's not easy. And I really appreciate to see the sessions that focus with ENA on that problems. But my question is about something else. Because Abigail basically made a call out there, what can we do to spread the good word about ENA and so on? And so far, what I heard is basically that, well, the ENA community goes out there, talk to people and bring them in contact and basically apply the method. We did this now with first ENA study out when David visited us in Frankfurt. It's a great success. But actually, we are thinking more on an institutional approach that basically we consult researchers in the future, social science research, but also healthcare. This is something I take from here on particular problems and would then apply ENA. And that's actually more a question for David, I think, or for the core stuff behind ENA. Maybe Abigail, you're also part of it. I don't know. How you feel about this? Is there any license model? Do you have any visions about, I don't know, a certified center thingy, what might not be the moment now because ENA is still starting up from my feeling. It's great to get these vibes on the early starting up community. But any thoughts about that, how that could spread? Because once it would be, well, just from in my case, it would be a unit in the university that will offer this. And if the question suits ENA, we would apply it and it would be more a bit of reselling the approach. And I'm wondering how David and others think about that.
Well, Abby, I'll let you get first crack at that question. I have some thoughts and then I'm actually going to throw it to somebody else yet again. But what do you, do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm going to make a comment. I'm not going to answer the question because I think you all are better situated to answer it. But one thing that really stood out to me at a conference last year and how I was thinking versus how I'm thinking about QE now is when I went to the ICQE conference last year, to me, quantitative ethnography was ENA and ENA was QE, and that was kind of it. But as I've done a little bit more introspection, especially in thinking about in preparation for this talk, why ENA, why QE resonated with me and with my human factors colleagues, I think QE is a little bit more than ENA. And one of the questions I wanted to pose, but that I thought might have been a little bit too inflammatory was, what is QE? Are we a science? Are we a discipline? Are we a collection of methodologists? Because I think that's kind of a fundamental question for us to answer, just if we're going to go out and sell this, because that's one thing I struggle with. When I talk about I'm using quantitative ethnography techniques, one of the first questions I get is, so is that like a science? Is that a discipline? Is that a method? And I use the generic, the QE community now to stave off that question, but I don't think it's the great answer. So I guess I'm adding another question to David's list. What is QE? Are we a science? Are we a discipline? Are we a society? Are we a community? What the heck are we?
Well, you've stolen the question I was going to ask you at the very end. But
yes.
I mean, I do think actually that part of the work of the community is actually to figure out what the answer to that question is. And I think there are two ways of thinking about that. One is what do we actually feel like the answer is for those of us in the community, and then how do we communicate that externally? So I think those are two separate things. And I still will throw something back to you about that. But coming back to Hendrik's question for a second, I mean, Abby's answer is totally relevant because, of course, the question is what is that campus center actually doing? Is it doing QE? Is it doing ENA? Like, you know, what is it a center of? My experience, having built many different tools of many different kinds over my career, is that selling tools is a bad idea. Like licensing tools is a bad idea, partly because, you know, we actually care about outcomes in the world, and restricting access isn't something that we want to do. I do think that it's possible to think of models around selling expertise, you know, selling more in-depth training. I mean, I think that this community is committed to having introductory classes and things that people can do to you know, to get started. But at some point, if you go into, you know, if you want to go in more depth, there has to be some way of you know, compensating the people who are doing that. And there's actually somebody in the conference who has been doing some thinking about that. I don't want to entirely put him on the spot because I think he's still thinking about it, but Brendan has been giving some thought to this, and I just want to make sure that I sort of, you know, Brendan, give you a chance to also weigh in with whatever you're thinking around that, at least at this stage in your investigations.
Yeah, I like the idea, or I like part of the Hendrik's question in terms of thinking about how institutions can kind of get involved in spreading these things. And I think we're seeing an emergence of different hubs of QE. And one of the things that a morning session that actually coincidentally was focused on healthcare, a theme that I think came out of all three of those things was actually being quite reflective on what QE was and being transparent about the decisions that were made, not just about using ENA, but getting back down to the coding decisions. I think like it was really quite a good thing. And I think that's part of how we can tell the story of QE and what it's doing as a field, discipline, whatever that is. And Barbara made a really good point, I think, in terms of talking about specifically their team in terms of having different perspectives and the different skill sets that are necessary to do a really deep, like help make a thick description, do really, really rigorous research to get at some of the complexities that I think we care about. So I think as we see the emergence of hubs and across the world, like that are going to be having these expertise in building teams, or we see distributed teams across different institutions, we need to be talking about not just we need to have the people that are really great at ethnography and sociology and anthropology help us who aren't as well versed in that learn or build good teams around that, and the people that are quite good at scraping the data and know everything you want to know about an SVD or a means rotation or hierarchical ENA or all these new things that are coming out, we have to continue to make it as easy as possible to connect with each other. And I think what ends up happening is we have a lot of great storytellers in this community, and we can be teaching each other and show kind of examples of here's how we did this and what are the lessons learned. And there's a lot of great papers where people are unpacking this. Simon talked about this in the QE web series. Is like we need to foreground a lot of the things that often get hidden, and sometimes it's ugly, sometimes it's difficult decisions. Sylvie's work has done a lot of this too. Like I'm going to have different types of segmentation, and sometimes it gets ugly, and I want to talk about those struggles. The more that we can do that and bring transparency to the work, and I think also just show kind of the value. It's also tricky too. We show the value over other approaches. I think that's one approach, but I'm going to be continuing to do a lot of thought. I've been reaching out to a lot of people, and I think many of us in the community are giving thought to these things. And I'm looking forward to the community session where we'll kind of grapple with some of these specifically. But if anyone wants to talk more about it, I'm very interested in furthering those discussions. I hope that got at some of what we were interested in.
So Hendrik, since we answered about 3 different questions, including the one you asked, you want to add anything more before we go on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It was a good. I think it's further to explore, but yeah, I think it's a community decision, and it's good to hear. I like what you said, David, about selling tools is a bad idea, and but you need to reward expertise in a way. Yeah, I think it's a good way.
Excellent. So I'm not seeing any more hands up, and I do have one more question of my own. But I'm really interested in some of what you said earlier, Abby, about the way that uptake has worked in the human factors community, and in a discipline that basically is, you know, has qualitative methods sort of firmly embedded in it. And I don't want to put Adam Lefstein on the spot exactly, but I know that last year at the conference, like one of the issues that you raised, Adam, was this question of, you know, who's willing to adopt it and under what conditions, sort of where does the pushback come from? And I'm wondering if what Abby was saying about the way that it's been taken up in human factors and how that relates to other branches of engineering, I wonder if so to be transparent, Adam is like very, very deeply steeped in qualitative methods, including ones that go way beyond my ability to engage with the richness of data. And I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on what we might learn from Abby's experience, given the way you've been thinking about it. You're free to say no, by the way. It's because it's late at night in Israel, so I don't want to put you on the spot too much. But
you preface by saying you don't want to put me on the spot.
Yes, that's always the academic way of putting somebody on the spot and with a disclaimer. You should know that as a conversation analyst. No, seriously. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that? Because I know that this was a big concern of yours, right?
I mean, we're in such different fields. I know from my colleagues who do work in health that they're always thinking about ways to quantify, because the medical profession likes numbers. Where I work, there's much less pressure to quantify. Actually, quite the opposite. You have to justify why you've quantified. But since you put me on the spot, can I ask a question in a different direction? I really enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much. And I've been thinking about these handovers and how, as somebody who does ethnography, how I go about studying them. And and it seems to me that I go and observe handovers instead of interviewing people about them. And I was just kind of curious, and I'm sure in human factors engineering, you do a lot of that, sort of observing how the systems work, and why the interviews, and why, could you use the same sort of tools with observation, or does it have something to do with wanting to use ENA to analyze the data? Does that make sense?
I muted myself because I've got a little doggy running around. He was yipping. Yeah, it totally does. So actually, David might remember when I was designing my dissertation, I wanted to go and do observations, and that got cut out for a number of reasons. But in this particular project, I was more interested in understanding the experience and perception of the people who were engaging in the work. So in light of that, I had to talk to them to understand their perceptions and experience. But I will say it was not, I went out and I interviewed them. I did go do observations first. It just wasn't, they weren't observations that were covered under an IRB protocol, so I couldn't collect data and then analyze and publish it. But I would never recommend going and doing an interview about any type of work or process without at least having an idea about the work and the process itself. Otherwise, your data will not lend itself to eventually allowing you to have a thick, rich description of the work context. It's really interesting, actually, that you mentioned maybe only using interviews to apply ENA. At the time when I did that, it was before Zilvi's really cool, awesome work on exploring different segmentation on interviews. And her and I actually presented in the same session last year. I remember being so excited to have finally found somebody that was using ENA on interview data too. So that was actually really hard for me to figure out how to segment that data. So kind of going back to the decision making on how I did that, I glossed over it in the talk. But it's really important when you have something like chat data, or even now I'm collecting data where we're audio recording simulated handoffs. I have natural breaks, turns of talk to form lines, which works a lot better actually than interview data. So I think those are basically my thoughts. Definitely in human factors, I would always say you have to observe the process. Don't even try to write the interview guide until you observed the process, at least some. And I think ENA data applies to almost everything. I've got eye tracking data now that I want to try ENA on, like one of the first ENA papers that I read. Haven't gotten there yet though, so Brendan, expect an email.
Okay. Any follow-up to that? Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, Abby.
No, I was just saying Mark has a little follow-up in the chat. If I've gotten your question, Adam, I think I did. I saw a thumbs up. So Mark is right on the line. He says it'd be interesting to observe simulations in university clinical simulators and with those teams. Yeah, so actually one of the studies that I'm working on analyzing, and we're using ENA to model the communication process in the actual handoff. We went to one of the life-size simulators, had an operating room team wheel in a sim junior, a little kid, give a handoff for a scenario we had designed before, audio record, video record. We have some eye tracking data too. And then we went and did a debrief afterwards with the team where we did a focus group. How do you think that go well? What didn't go well? After we did individual surveys, so that before anybody was biased by hearing what the surgeon thought, you know, the nurse had a chance to, on the survey, write, this was horrible. I got none of my questions answered. Yeah,
Cool.
Definitely the
That's
way I'm
great.
thinking.
Yeah, I want to follow up with you about that data because it sounds like incredibly rich data just for thinking about methodological questions. So we're almost at time. There is a coffee break after where people can pick Abby's brain to, if not their heart's content, at least her heart's content. But Abby, I do want to ask you, oh, and I should also add, by the way, for those of you listening, Adam just gave us a master class in what to do if somebody puts you on the spot in a in a session. So thank you for handling that so graciously. But so Abby, you know, in your talk, you used the phrase at one point, philosophy of QE, and I'm wondering just what does that mean to you? I'm not asking you to give a definitive definition for the community, but when you say, you know, I'm interested in working within the philosophy of QE, what is that? What does that mean to you personally? Or professionally, I
So
guess.
I think this is a really good question. So the first obvious answer, and I think there's different layers of this answer, but the QE community in general really actually stops to think about the philosophy behind science and what that means. And I'm an engineer. I'm usually focused on solving a problem, and I don't stop to think about necessarily why am I framing the problem that way, or why am I approaching it that way. So that was the first time that I realized that this community has a different philosophy of approaching science than I do. And it's made me grow quite a bit, actually. The second thing I think that's really important, especially given what I've said about a lot of my big, higher level, big D discipline of industrial engineering being very quantitative, is sometimes it would be easy for someone to lose the ethnography portion of quantitative ethnography. They're really taking the time to understand the context and the culture of the people who you're interacting with and who are participating in your research. And I think that is something that's really fundamental and has pushed me scientifically and as a scholar, because it would be very easy for me to look at the data from the care transition and without having been exposed to ethnography, forget the nuances and the power hierarchy, and even one that isn't touched at all on the topic today, but how a patient might fit into that or not fit into that. I think the ethnography part of quantitative ethnography really helps tap into that. And then the third layer to this across all of those is the QE community, or part of the philosophy of doing QE is you have to do it extremely rigorously. I think that probably comes back to you, David. And it's just, we've all been indoctrinated with that. But I think that's also really important to think about the rigor of our methods and what we're doing. So considering philosophy of science at all, step number one for me. And then step number 2A and 2B, make sure it's rigorous. And then don't forget the ethnography part. Don't get caught up in the making the pretty diagrams, the having the numbers, being able to do statistical tests, and forget the people part.
Wow, well, that is a great. I think you answered Hendrik's question better than I ever could, or you answered the question that you answered for Hendrik better than I ever could.